Hey guys, Coach Pop here. Thanks for joining me for the video cast. Today we're looking at the Aztec Empire, and if you notice at the top, the dates, the as great as this empire was, it was a relatively short period of time, largely because it's cut short by the arrival of the Spanish. Nonetheless, as we go through, be thinking about how this relates to other post-classical empires in Afro-Eurasia. Um, but one thing I want to start off with is explaining that the word Aztec or the Aztec Empire, the Azteca, is the word for the whole empire. The word Aztec is related to the empire. The people that start the empire actually called themselves the Mexica, and they were an ethnic group that migrated into the Valley of Mexico, claiming they were descendants of the Toltecs. The Toltecs, if you remember, when their city state and their small empire declines, they just abandon their capital city at Tula. Some of them wandered north, and the Mexica claim they are the descendants of those people. But then they will migrate back into the Valley of Mexico and eventually found a city called Tenochtitlan. Now, do not confuse Tenochtitlan with Teotihuacan. I know that's a little bit confusing. But there's a very interesting story about the founding of the city of Tenochtitlan that involves an eagle and a snake, which immediately you should recognize as some sort of link to the god Quetzalcoatl. According to the story, the people are wandering around trying to find a new place to build a city and establish their homeland. And one of their holy men sees an eagle with a snake in its talons land on a cactus uh, on an island in the middle of this large but shallow lake system. And he declares that's a sign from the god Quetzalcoatl. That is where we are supposed to found our city. And so they do. Now, the city is built up over the course of a hundred years or so, and then starts the imperial expansion. So Tenochtitlan is the city of the Mexica, who will then go and start conquering the city-states around the lake system. They are two separate things, even though we tend to think of them together. Now, the city of Tenochtitlan is a very interesting one. As I mentioned, it's an island in the middle of this lake system, and the link to the god Quetzalcoatl is seen in the name. The name itself means the foundation of heaven. They literally thought this was sacred space that was designed by the god Quetzalcoatl for them to establish their greatness. And greatness it was, because the city would eventually grow, even though it's on this island, to 150,000 people. That makes it the second largest city in all of pre-Columbian America, second only to Teotihuacan, which had 200,000 people. Again, this would have been the largest city, or among the largest, in all of Europe at that particular time. Now, because it was an island in the middle of the lake, it required certain construction projects, especially building causeways, which, if you look on this map, the straight lines that are connecting the island to the outer parts of the lake system are causeways. Causeways are like earth bridges, except that the water can't go below them. But they're obviously designed so that you could carry, anything across land from the outskirts of the lake to the island itself. And then a canal system within the city was a primary way of transportation, leading the Spanish to call it, when they saw it, the Venice of the Americas. Venice, if you remember, a city that is designed around a series of canals. This is an image from far later, trying to sort of recreate what it might have looked at. And what you notice is the city center, and then canals that are dug to create a kind of transportation infrastructure within the city itself. Now, in terms of their society, the Mexica, the ethnic group that start the empire, were themselves divided into 7 clans, which they called Calpulli. These are extended family groups within this ethnic group, the Mexica. And the Calpulli were responsible for all sorts of things, including the land itself, organizing labor and warriors, maintaining the temples and schools. And so when the Mexica start building their empire, then it's the Calpulli who will end up becoming the nobles of this empire that it continues to expand. They continue to control the priesthood, for example, the military, the merchant class, as we'll see in just a moment. In terms of their society as well, at least in terms of patriarchy, women were definitely subordinate to men in Aztec society all throughout the Aztec Empire. They were expected to grind corn every day for 6 hours, which, if you stop and think about it, that's a pretty remarkable burden to bear. Every single day, you have to grind corn for 6 hours before you do anything else. There was, of course, patriarchy that is expressed in arranged marriages. Women have no choice over who they are allowed to marry. Polygamy was not uncommon. However, the Aztec, like the Maya, practiced gender parallelism. And if you remember, that means that there's two separate hierarchies, one for men and one for women, that sort of correspond to each other, even though men are superior to women. But they also add a new twist called parallel descent. Parallel descent means that the woman's lineage comes from her mother and the man's lineage comes from the father. Even though they might share the same parents, everything is determined by your gender. So, for example, what that means is if a woman has a title that requires her to have to perform a particular public ritual, let's say, when she dies, that title is passed on to her daughter. Same thing with possessions. We think of property typically as land, which they did not own the land, but they could own private possessions, and those would be passed down. So, for example, jewelry or ornamental, any sort of ornament like a costume or a headdress, things like that, would be passed from mother to daughter, but also from father to son, but they did not cross over. So an unusual new twist that we see there. In terms of their political system, as I mentioned, they are an empire, even though they start off as an independent city-state, by conquering the local peoples. And initially, those are the people that are surrounding the city-states around the lake system in the Valley of Mexico. Now, each city-state has a king that they called speaker. Okay, so when the Mexica conquered them, then they become subject to the great speaker, who is the ruler of Tenochtitlan, a Mexica. So if you kind of think about it, what we see is a kind of king of kings system here. The king, the speaker of a conquered city-state, was allowed to stay in power, but he has to acknowledge the greater rule of the great speaker, who is in effect then the emperor. The whole system, though, is centered in a way that's kind of unique around the notion that the great speaker is a god. He's a descendant of a god that makes him a living god. Um, but at the center of the state system, it's a tributary empire. When they conquer other people, the speaker of the conquered city-state gets to stay in power so long as he recognizes the greater authority of the great speaker, but he has to pay tribute. Now, from the earliest part, we'll talk more about this in class, the city-states that they conquered to start forming their tributary empire, they pay tribute in exchange for participating in their domestic trade network. In a way that's very similar to what the post-classical Chinese dynasties tried to do, particularly the Tang dynasty. But the tribute is interesting because while we tend to think of tribute in the form of luxury goods, in the case of the Aztec Empire, the tribute was typically in the form of food, which is an issue that's going to come up again and we'll look at more closely in class. Food insecurity was always an issue for the Aztec Empire. And so it's kind of unusual in world history that a tributary empire forces its subject to pay tribute in the form of food, but they need it literally. And then finally, they have to pay tribute in the form of slaves. And again, unlike other systems where the slaves are used for labor primarily, they might be used for labor for a while, but eventually they're going to be used for human sacrifice. So let's take a quick look at the culture of the Aztec Empire. First of all, throughout the Aztec Empire, even among the conquered peoples, the idea of poetry and art is very prized. There's this expression, songs and flowers. The songs, of course, are poems that because they didn't have a technical writing system, were part of an oral tradition. But one of the great kings, the king of Texcoco, who was uh, paid tribute to the great speaker Nezahualcóyotl, who's one of my favorite figures in all of history. He wasn't just a king and a warrior; he was also an accomplished poet. And some of his songs are recorded by the Nahua, giving it to the Spanish friars later on. But at the center of their culture has to do with their mythology. And they maintain the traditional gods of Mesoamerica, including Quetzalcoatl. However, in a sort of unique twist, over time, this guy on the right becomes privileged as the supreme god. Now, his name is Huitzilopochtli, okay? He's the god of the sun, but also of warfare and human sacrifice. And those three things become intertwined to form what, in effect, turns out to be a militaristic, state-sponsored cult. The worship of Huitzilopochtli is very much tied to the Aztec idea of how their empire is supposed to work and how human sacrifice fits into that. So let's talk about how their sacrifice system works. First of all, it ends up forming an ideology of expansion. It fuels their imperial conquest. And it does this by creating a kind of circular logic that looks something like this. The warriors go out and conquer other people to supply slaves. Those slaves, in turn, are sacrificed to the god Huitzilopochtli, who is not just the god of the sun and of warfare, but I'm sorry, and human sacrifice, but also of warfare. And so, in sacrificing those slaves, that in turn fuels the warriors to go out and get more slaves, who are then sacrificed, who fuel the warriors to get more slaves, who are then sacrificed, that fuels the. And so it creates this like feedback loop that just constantly requires more and more conquest. This is a great deal different than the role of human sacrifice in Maya society, for example. First of all, it is directly tied to the idea of imperial expansion. The human sacrifice, as practiced by the Maya, for example, was a kind of way to try to tamp down conflict among different city states, but it's having the opposite effect in the Aztec Empire. A second big difference is just the scope and scale. The number of humans who are sacrificed is astronomically greater in Aztec culture than in any of the other Mesoamerican cultures. It also may have had a function, while not deliberate, of maintaining population control, particularly if you remember the fact that food insecurity is sort of at the heart of their imperial expansion. And then related to that is this quite unusual but very rare instances where we have evidence that it appears ritual cannibalism was actually practiced. Again, very rarely, But some of these sacrificial victims do have, the bones have evidence that they were actually consumed by other humans. This is an image that was recorded by the Spanish that is obviously showing the gore. But the one thing I want to point out here, because it's something we'll talk about more later in class, is the notion of taking the sacrificed victim's heart out while it's still beating, and then offering it to the god Huitzilopochtli as a part of this particular ritual. Okay, in terms of their economy, the domestic economy, by the way, was very much controlled by tributary agreements, particularly, as I mentioned, for food and slaves. But then those conquered city-states that paid tribute then had free access to the markets within the empire itself. But beyond the empire, there was this special merchant class called the Pochteca. The Pochteca were kind of like advance men. You could almost think of them as like double agents or a kind of spies, but they came from the Calpulli, the original clans of the Mexica, and they were going out long distance to look for luxury goods primarily, because again, the domestic economy was much more focused on moving around food items and manufactured goods for everyday use. But they were also looking for something else, because while they're going out and trading with people, more or less fair trade, they're also sort of scouting and looking for people that could be conquered and then incorporated into this tributary empire. The network that the Pochteca established extends all the way into the southeast part of the United States. And if you remember, Teotihuacan and then later the Toltecs also established trade up there, because up in that area is a very valuable resource to them that we'll look at more in class, called turquoise. And so what the Pochteca do is they sort of retrace those older trade networks, but now with a totally different purpose, not only to secure luxury goods that could then be redistributed to the elite among the empire, but also to scout out new places that they might try to conquer. Now, when they're going out and making contacts with these faraway city-states or villages or whatever they might be, they typically traded using barter. So again, it was a free market in terms of the long-distance exchange. They also used cacao as currency. Now, we'll talk about cacao in class at some point more, but it wasn't just for chocolate like as a little treat. It had a ritual purpose for people all throughout Mesoamerica, and so the cacao bean was actually sometimes used as an early form of currency. Now, in terms of the economy and the agricultural base, everything it revolves around maize. But as we'll see in class, there's a problem producing enough food, and so that's one of the reasons why food was often provided as a tribute. But that food insecurity leads to a very unique system called Chinampas. And the phrase that necessity is the mother of invention certainly holds true when you're talking about food. You have to find a way to try to grow more food, and the Chinampa system was the effect that was the way they tried to do this. Basically, what Chinampas are like floating gardens. And initially, they were created in the area around the island that eventually would form Tenochtitlan. And because there was a limited amount of land, they in effect have to try to create places to grow food that wasn't in, firm ground. This image comes from the Spanish later on, and it's debatable how accurate that is. But this is a diagram we're going to study more closely in class that really sort of illustrates how exactly this system worked. And the basic idea was this: there would be floating mats that were made out of reeds. Reeds are weeds that grow in areas that are underwater to a small degree. and then they would place the mat, float it, and then sort of stake it down. The lake system in the Valley of Mexico was a very shallow lake system, but they would stake it down and then plant willow trees along the edges. The willow trees would eventually sink their roots and anchor it to the bottom of the lake, and then they would plant maize and beans in rows on the Chinampas. And the way that the harvest works then is you basically just go along your canoe in the channel between the Chinampas, and it's like, pushing a grocery cart through Publix and just picking out the stuff that you need. A very ingenious system, but it's also a system that illustrates how desperate they were to find ways to get enough food to feed this giant city on a finite amount of land on an island. So we'll look at some of these issues much more closely in class as we continue looking at how geography affects the political economy of pre-Columbian peoples. I want to thank you for your attention, and I'll look forward to seeing you in class.